I don't think anybody is planning to go invest in Georgia just because a bunch of people shout on TV, we're the top reformers. So I think that the real question to me is, does this lead to better development policy, which gets people out of poverty, however we want to describe it? And that is, I think, our key question. And I think Jaime put his finger on the button, which is sort of what's the dashboard? How does it relate to policy? Now, so I have a couple problems with parts of the index. First of all, you have two stock variables that are very hard to change over time in terms of policy. Certainly, we just don't have a good adult education program that works in Africa. The impact value is just not good on that. So if we're going to use the adult stock of education, we don't have a policy lever really associated with that. We have a policy lever associated with children's education. We know that policy matters there. We know it makes a difference, and we know why Uganda does better than Ethiopia. So we know what to do there. But on like the stock of people, adults in the labor force, definitely not. So, and I have trouble, and then also there's the child that died and the sensitivity of household size. These indices are also sensitive to population density. That's part of what's going on in that Kenya example, which you could explain. The more dense the population is, the more likely they are to get better access to services. But my second so I think that's why I ask you which variables would you like if you could have them, because I think we ought to maybe try that question. But my fundamental problem, before Jaime cuts me off, is that this is fundamentally based on the public provision, otherwise known as the dead aid model. It is not based on the kind of social entrepreneur economic opportunity approach. So in the recent language of CNN, it is kind of based on the hippos and not the lions. The hippos. The hippos and not the lions. So the lions are the social entrepreneurs, the young, dynamic African leaders, and the hippos are the ones that are sitting in the mud with their eyes closed trying to provide services in a clientelistic way and having it all paid for through aid instead of people earning their money to provide things. So that's the hippos lion. Sorry. You have to watch CNN. You know, I mean, it's just there. So I guess, so to me, if this multidimensional poverty index starts to drive our surveys, leaving out the element of economic opportunity, for me, especially someone who's working in Africa, that it will be a huge problem. And I think we need to think about it. But I have to say on the plus side of this, that for low-income countries, there's a reason why Nobu's getting like 0.3. Because our consumptions our surveys do an absolutely horrific job of measuring consumption. The non-sampling error is unbelievably huge. Every time we look at one of these surveys, we find all kinds of reasons why consumption was really poorly measured. Like they gave illiterate people a diary, or, you know, whatever. They changed the way, whatever, let's not go there. It's just huge. So maybe we really need to spend, especially for countries where we're so far from the frontier of the gold standard, if you think consumption welfare is the gold standard of poverty measure. We're so far from it, and we're going to be so far from it for a long time, that I think it does suggest that it's worth investing in it. So I would like to think about in the future how we could include this economic opportunities angle to have a, because I think that actually goes back to what the Bolivians want. They want a good job, right? That's an economic opportunity, right? Okay, that's what I have.
Thank you very much. One or two more questions, and then we go back to the presenters and panelists. 1, 2, 3.
Forgot about the monkeys in the trees, right, that came from Roderick.
Okay, so let's go back to, I don't know who wants to start, Gonzalo, or please, any order? And then we go to any of the panelists who want to make a final point.
I think a key question here is how James started, and then Samuel put it, there is a demand there for these type of indicators.
Exactly.
So the question is, what can we do, or what can the World Bank do if countries are demanding that? And there will be many countries demanding that. Of course, as Gabriel said, perhaps Sudan won't demand that. But with all due respect to Sudan and countries similar, they have more important problems. I mean, if the president is accused for genocide, the least of the problems for them is getting a new way of measuring poverty, or squaring the matrix. I mean, that will come. I mean, we tried to have an evaluation system in Mexico like 20 years ago, and but without democracy and transparency, that doesn't work. So, I mean, the first thing they have to solve in some countries is that one. But some of other countries which are moving towards measurement and moving towards transparency and evaluation, then the demand will be there. So the question is, what can we do to those? Say, well, no, thank you, we don't do that. They are clients, let's say. A quick remark here. When you say, well, we should try either use the law to set cutoffs or use the economic theory or data to see what is set the cutoff for education. I think both are not separate ones. What happens with Congress people is that they use information from economists, from sociologists, and they set their new cutoffs with all the information available. So if suddenly, let's say, good economists show that university education should be the cutoff for anything, if Congress people get it, then you have both things at the same time, one after the other. So those things are linked. And finally, as we want to put it sometimes, if a doctor only measures the blood pressure, perhaps he should measure blood pressure every time you see him. But in order to have a better diagnosis, sometimes, if it's worth doing that, he can spend a bit more money on measuring something else. So we are not forgetting about poverty measured by income. We are not saying that we're going to throw that apart. We should measure that because it is already there and it tells you something. But why not measuring as a complement some of the parts of the body, let's say, to see if we can have a better diagnosis? So those things are complementing each other. Let's stick to income, but try to go a bit further when there's a possibility of measuring that for the sake of the patient.
You can use, I think this one's closer.
I can move my place and I'll make it try this. Fortunately, most everyone said everything that I ever wanted to say, so I don't have a lot to say, except to remind ourselves that one of the things that this sort of technology allows is a moving back a little bit from the actual determinant of a methodology. We actually pull ourselves a little bit away from it. We can still add advice as to what might have been a good process for getting from A to B. We might actually have some advice from other experiences as to what a bad variable or a good variable might be, or that weights might be too large or too small for whatever reason. But the fact is, it leads you to a territory that's not very comfortable. That is, we're not going to have an answer that's the same for every client in the kind of way that we had with consumption-based approaches. That's something I think that we just have to get used to. And the question is, what will allow us to feel the level of comfort in advising a government? I don't know yet. And I'm hoping that through these sorts of discussions, we'll have a heck of a lot more that we'll be able to say in the ensuing years as I take the walk a couple of blocks from GW over here again in the future. Now, Sabina.
We'll give you a permanent pass then to the
I think the most thing is I've learned a lot from the interventions of the people who spoke, and I'm very, very grateful for that. I I think standing back also that, in a sense, we are 15 years or further. We're very far behind income poverty, and we're very far behind developing the conventions, the technical base, the capacity building in lots of different very specific contexts and issues that income poverty and consumption poverty have. And so in a sense, it's a time to try to, little by little, learn from that experience, speak with those who did that, and figure out what are some conventions, what are some technical standards, what are the kinds of training and capacity building which would be useful at this point. I will take a shot at the repeated discussion of better indicators and dimensions. I think health is the difficult one because there are EQ5D, 5 dimensions of health: pain and energy and morbidity and mental health and whatever, mobility. So to do a proper health module could take forever. And so the question is, and that's one for health experts, and I wouldn't pretend to know it, is what is the shortest defensible thing? But I think it would be very useful to have some health information for more than simply the respondent in the household, to be able to look at other members as we do for education. So there are, like the LSMS module has things about going uphill or about sweeping the floor, but having something like that, or some questions on disability for every person in the household. And clearly, both in health and education, the deficit right now is anything on quality. And so again, what are the shortest indicators that could add something about quality, something about outcome in terms of education and skills? We should mention that our 5 years of education has no age limit. So if a child has 5 years of school, that's fine. So we don't have it. Then in terms of the standard of living, there have been a number of observations. We don't include assets of livestock. There's not land. There's not who owns the land. So there would be a number of different aspects. But again, I think where that has to go is into the literature on permanent income, on the use of asset indicators, and there's a whole literature there. And so trying to figure out from them what's the most parsimonious set of comparable indicators. And then the 2 dimensions that I mentioned earlier that we had wished in particular to include with HDR also were work and empowerment. Work, including informal work, including something to do with quality of work as well as remuneration or safety at work. But that does, as Louis said, bringing in some kind of opportunity. And since we couldn't at that time have income or consumption, something about the employment environment of the people seems very important, and particularly important to include the informal as well. And then, as many of you observed, the MPI indicators could be met in a prison. They could be met by a very authoritarian state. And so having empowerment is important for 2 reasons. One is there might be intrinsic importance to freedom, to being able to pursue the goals that a person values, and then also people being empowered as entrepreneurs, as agents, has instrumental values on their future outcomes. And so that seems to be an important dimension to include, not only in the sense of decision-making within a household, but empowerment vis-a-vis the market or vis-a-vis social structures of discrimination. So that would be a very rough wish list or discussion, but I think that, in a sense, what would be useful would be to get a group of people, each of whom have different expertise, to come at this in different ways and see what is the process by which a better answer than that could be generated. And finally, a number of the interventions spoke about the interface between politics, whether in Bolivia or Sudan or other places, and the construction of measures. In 1972, Sen, with Partha Dasgupta and Steve Margolin, did a book on project evaluation for UNIDO. And they remembered a fairy tale, the Aesop's fable about belling the cat, where all the mice decided that the cat needed to be belled because it was a menace. And then the question is, who's going to do it? And so all the economists decided that the politicians in the UNIDO manual needed to set distributional weights, because that was the weight. It was a weight question, but it was on distributional weights. And they decided that, but then the politicians didn't want to cooperate. And so who would bell the cat? Who would sit a politician against the wall and make them come up with the weights that we could use? So I guess in that situation where there is an interface, what I really liked was your